Who we are is based off of millions of tiny data points. What color you see when you look at a dress, how old you are, where you grew up, how healthy you are, what job you do, who you go home to, even what presidential election was happening when you first started to pay attention to the world. All of these little experiences and idiosyncrasies and unique things about us actually shape the way that our brains process the world around us. These filters have a name in psychology. They're called schema. And since I'm not a psychologist, these people that I'm about to play can give you an example better than I can.
Most of the factors that predict whether or not something that is being perceived will also be remembered operate in the first few seconds of learning. One of these factors involves something termed a schema, and whether or not the new learning bumps into one. Let me show you an example of a schema by having Dr. Whitehead and myself read a paragraph to you, one actually taken from a famous research paper. Your job is to remember as many facts about the paragraph as you can. Let me tell you in advance that you are going to fail miserably at this task unless I do something first. I can instantly improve your memory score from between 50 to 100% simply by adding 7 little words before you hear Dr. Whitehead and myself. But I'm not going to do that. You will hear the paragraph first, then I will read you the words.
The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do.
If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many.
In the short run, this might not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well.
After the procedure is completed, one arranges the materials into different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places.
Eventually, they'll be used once more in the whole cycle. They'll have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life.
Did you get all that? No? Let us give you now the 7 magic little words. This paragraph is all about washing clothes. What that sentence provides for you is a mental framework, a way of organizing thoughts around some aspect of the world. We call such frameworks schemas, and you have them about people, situations, objects. This means something profound. Prior knowledge can disturbingly shape how you memorize and retain for long-term storage future knowledge. If a schema is triggered near the moment of learning, that learning is more permanent.
Brains!
They're cute. So our brains have evolved this process over time in order to help us get better at organizing and process information, to help make future situations and information processing easier. Or to put it a different way, it helps us take the million different things that we see and do and hear and say in any given day, and it helps us provide some context so that we know what to remember and what not to remember. It's sort of like how Sleepless in Seattle is only a romantic comedy because of the music that plays in the background and not a crazy stalker movie. Glad you guys laughed at that. I was worried it was a little bit too old. So our schema are based on a lifetime of experience interacting with the world around us. And by definition, we as people are more likely to notice things that fit in with our schema. And when we run into things that don't, we tend to discount them as exceptions to the rule, instead of changing our schema in the face of contradictory information. And so take all of these truths about our individuality and how it shapes our experience and put it on the internet. So similar to how our brains have evolved schema to help us process new information, the internet has developed algorithms to filter information. And these algorithms are necessary because there is so much information generated on the internet in any given day. This is a graphic from Domo, which is a leading business intelligence tool. And one of the things that it shows, or all of the things that it shows, is this is how much information is generated every minute of the day on these platforms. And so YouTube users upload 72 hours of new video every minute. Facebook users share 2,460,000 items every minute. Email users send 204 million messages every minute. And so it follows that we need to be able to filter the web because it would be basically useless without it. And so similar to how our brains have evolved schema to help us process new information, The internet has developed algorithms. And how the digital algorithms filter your online experience sort of depends on who you are as an internet person. So this person also has filters. They're shaped around your daily activities, both on and off the web. And some of these filters are self-assessed. You actively choose who you follow or friends, what subreddits you subscribe to, what blogs you put in your RSS feed. So in many ways, our individual internet experiences are very much of our own making. But there's an automated side to this that's often very invisible to us. Think for a second how well your internet browser would know you if it were a person. How well would it know you if it just knew the following information? How often you log into Blackboard? You guys still use Blackboard, right? Okay. That you just set your Facebook relationship status to engaged. That you just set up your LinkedIn profile. That you follow Tennessee football on Twitter. That you follow Hillary Clinton on Twitter. Using just these data points, you can reasonably infer that you're probably a college student who's maybe a junior or a senior and getting ready to go out into the real world. And you can reasonably infer that maybe you're a little bit of a Democrat and that you like college football. But that's not all that your browser knows about you, right? And because what your browser is the place where you have confided all of your curiosities and your quest for answers. It knows who you're friends with and how often you interact with them. It knows who you follow, what you click on, what you buy, how often you log in, what your favorite sites are and how often you go to them, what topics you're interested in. And so all of the data from these filters can tell us a lot about who you are and what it is that you're likely to do in the future as an internet person. And so this data sort of dictates the way that the internet around us ends up being filtered. And since innovation follows money, generally, it's not surprising that advertisers were among the first people to figure out that they could save money by making their messaging more efficient by only targeting ads to people that were likely to be interested in their message. This makes sense. It's the whole backbone of a good media buying strategy, after all. And so how it works is this. You go to a website. There's an ad that's supposed to load on the website. The website talks to your browser and says, hey, internet, this is the type of person that I have. 22-year-old college senior who drives a car that's between 6 and 10 years old, can know maybe your household income, your relationship status, knows a whole bunch of stuff about you. And so the ad server sends that information into the cloud and it says, hey, internet, does anybody have an ad that they are interested in showing to this person? And all of the advertisers that live in this ecosystem can then bid on any one of those characteristics that it thinks are important for the opportunity to serve you an impression. And then the highest bidder wins. And all of this happens all around you all the time on the internet in like less than a hundredth of a second. It's really unbelievable. And so the whole point of this ecosystem is that it allows advertisers to target people that are most likely to engage with their message. Again, this is the whole backbone of a good media buying strategy. And in reality, it's actually usually a pretty good thing for consumers too, because it means that when you're on the internet, the ads around you are at least somewhat relevant to you. And so in theory, your entire internet experience is improved. So essentially, it just does a very good job at matching messages to audience. I'll say that 10 times fast. But the algorithms filter more than just advertising. They also affect the news and information that we see. Google filters news and search results based on what it thinks is most relevant to you. And Facebook filters your newsfeed based on what it thinks that you're likely to be interested in. And this includes the news stories that hit your newsfeed. Political campaigns are part of this too. Can I just comment for a second that like this CNN did this graphic and it's just really creepy and it's been all over the place this entire election. So political campaigns do this too. Data targeting gives them more bang for their advertising buck, and it lets them target very specific messages with very specific audiences. Campaigns now have very robust data operations that are dedicated to taking the information that you supply when you register to vote, so your address, your phone number, what party you register for, and your name, among maybe some other things. And it matches that up with how often you show up at the polls, and then it matches that to your online persona. And this lets them formulate algorithms that can predict how likely you are to show up at the polls on election day, among some other things. Recent estimates suggest that the use of this database and algorithm platforms can affect a candidate's results in the final tally by 2 to 3 percentage points. The Cruz campaign is probably the best at this cycle. They've hired a team of behavioral psychologists to take your internet persona and map it out to what is essentially your Myers-Briggs personality type. And then from there, it layers on some additional things that it's gathered that you're interested in. And it can sort you into categories like, and this is just a few of them, relaxed leader and temperamental conservative and stoic traditionalist. Then it uses this data to determine which messages you might be most receptive to. So if it's determined that you're a temperamental conservative, I should do this in order. If it's determined that you're a true believer, you might respond better to a message about Ted Cruz's faith. If you're a stoic traditionalist, you may respond better to a message about immigration. If you're a temperamental conservative, you might respond to a message about Ted Cruz and the Second Amendment. And it's not just online advertising tailored this way. They also use it to instruct the volunteers that they send to go door to door in efforts to get out the vote on how to talk to you. So this is how that works. Campaign volunteer, before she walks up to your house, has an app on her phone, and since you've provided your address when you registered to vote, she can run your address through the database, and the database will tell her which script to follow when you answer the door. Now, if our online behavior is going to now tie back to our real-life self, that sort of calls into question, is who we are on the internet an accurate depiction of who we are in the real world? So yes and no. The line is a little bit blurry here. The internet determines the way that you publicly display your best self, as well as all of the things that you search for in the middle of the night when you're not able to sleep. So in that sense, we're very good at predicting behavior because we just have so much data to sort through. And that means we're able to pull very strong statistical correlations among human populations. So for example, taking only the things that you like on Facebook, we're able to accurately predict a wide range of personal attributes. Things like sexual orientation, religion, political leaning, personality, intelligence, even whether or not your parents are divorced. And the things that are used on Facebook to predict this behavior are not always obvious. The best predictors for high intelligence are liking the pages for thunderstorms, the Colbert Report, science, and curly fries. We'll get back to that. Best predictors for male heterosexuality are the Wu-Tang Clan. Martin Shkreli is very validated by that. Shaq, science, and being confused after waking up from naps. So curly fries doesn't really match closely with high intelligence, does it? So it turns out that the Facebook page for curly fries was created by somebody who was pretty intelligent. And since we're all likely in our social circles to be friends with people who share the same common attributes as us, his smart friend who shared it with their smart friends. And so it's not liking the page for curly fries that is the predictor of high intelligence. It's that so many other intelligent people like the page for curly fries that it makes it statistically likely that you are highly intelligent as well. So theoretically, you wouldn't otherwise know that the page exists. Except, unless you just like curly fries and you search for curly fries to like it on Facebook, in which case I can't really help you. The University of Essex study in 2013 concluded that the mere presence of a mobile phone in an environment makes us more distracted. It physically takes over a small part of our attention, and this makes us feel less connected to each other, and makes us less present for each other. When we do things face-to-face, like apologize or break up with someone or ask them out on a date, we're able to have a shared emotional experience. You ask somebody out, for example, you have to speak through your nerves, and you can see the other person's face light up in acceptance or look away in rejection, and then you have to modify your behavior accordingly. So empathy is an important thing for us to have as people. We're required to use it to appropriately recognize and handle the emotional reactions of the people around us. So too often, when we do things over the internet that we would otherwise do face-to-face, We're not really required to think about the emotional consequences of our words, and we're certainly not required to deal with them in real time. And so the internet doesn't really have a mechanism to force us to modify our behavior to account for the feelings of someone else. And so the mere act of doing something on a device that you would otherwise do face-to-face strips out some of our empathy. And empathy is important because being able to connect with each other and put ourselves in someone else's shoes is a quintessential piece of what it means to be a human. And it's certainly one of the things that is needed for us to have an effective and functioning democracy. And so it follows that this alone maybe makes us a little less inclined to be kind to each other on the internet. And so maybe our internet personas are not always what we want directly tied to our lives. Let's stop for a second and answer any questions if anybody has them. Okay. So let's talk about the modern news environment for a bit. It's a little bit of a pivot. Started micro, and now we're gonna step back a little bit. So it's easy for us in 2016 to assume that the role of journalism is to be objective. But the inherent bias of the media as a whole tracks strongly with the methods of distribution of the news. And the distribution strategy of the news is highly dependent on how media organizations make money, because they're businesses, after all. And so in the early days of America, newspapers were actually financed by the government and political parties. And their whole purpose was to be a mouthpiece for party politics. In fact, it wasn't until the 20th century that the news media was financially incentivized towards objectivity. And this shift is largely due to a shift in business model. They realized that they can make money on subscriptions and advertising, and that means that money is to be made by keeping as many people happy as possible. And to do that, newspapers had to be objective. And so in the 21st century, the internet is rapidly changing the traditional revenue streams of media, like rapidly. Most newspapers have seen their print subscriptions and advertising revenue tank. For most sites on the internet, money is to be made based on the amount of traffic that a site can get, which means the media isn't really incentivized towards objectivity. It's incentivized to get you to click on things. And so if the methods of distribution are so important to the media's role in our lives, how are people getting political news in 2016? So 91% of US adults are paying attention to the 2016 election in any given week. And actually, I read this weekend, the Washington Post came out with a study. The more people are paying attention, the less likely they feel like they want to vote. Yeah. So if you look at this, cable news comes in at 24% as far as resources that people cite as being the most helpful. But if you add up all of the things in this column that are associated with the internet, so social media, news website, email, candidate website, it actually comes in higher than cable news. It's actually about 30%. And among those people that get their political news on the internet, 48% of them cite Facebook as one of the most crucial sources to them. This gap is generational. 61% of millennials claim they get their politics and government news from Facebook in any given week. This trend is not reflected among baby boomers. They still prefer to get their news from more traditional channels. However, this doesn't make boomers much better, because when boomers do get their news from Facebook, they're much more likely to only see things that are in line with their ideology. And so what are the things that we click on the internet? One, we click on things that we already agree with, things that fit into our predetermined schema. Two, we click on things that make us feel the most feelings, either direction, right? So anger and anxiety on one end, and laughter and wonder and happiness on the other. The more emotion something makes us feel, the more likely we are to click on it. Next, we're pretty likely to click on things like hyperbole and superlative. This is the reason that clickbait does so well. These are headlines that promise to blow your mind. And finally, numbers and lists. These sort of help our brains process information better. We're just predisposed to enjoy reading a thing in a list form. And in addition to being predisposed to click on things that make us particularly emotional, there's also the issue of similarity. So if you tend to click on articles about conservative politics, that signals to the algorithm that you're likely to click on things that lean to the right. And if you like to click on stories about liberal politics, that signals to the algorithms that you're likely to click on things that lean to the left. And so over time, even though we have access to more information than ever before, we're shown mostly stuff that we're already predisposed to agree with, that's predisposed to make us emotional, and this limits our exposure to things that might challenge our preconceived views. Plus, people are creatures of habit. So just naturally, we tend to limit the things that we read in any given day. So all of this has a name. It's called the filter bubble. And this is an emerging field of study in internet algorithms. A filter bubble is basically a digital echo chamber of confirmation bias. And it serves to make us more sure that our singular view of the world is the correct one. I should mention that Facebook especially is paying high attention to this, mostly because they're the biggest perpetrators. And in their own internal research, they've found that who you're friends with and what you share tends to be slightly more indicative of your filter bubble than the Facebook algorithm directly. However, Facebook commissioned the study, and it's not really able to easily replicate. That's the word I want. And the Facebook filter study also said, so the effect of algorithm in filtering news is stronger for liberals than conservatives. But when presented with news that contains opposing views, conservatives click a lot less than liberals. And probably the most important piece, only 7% of the content that's clicked on Facebook is considered hard news. What hard news is the stuff that's relevant to the world around you, right? So a fire in a refugee camp in Syria would be considered hard news. 21 pictures of a cute dog jumping into a river would be considered soft news. So only 7% of the stuff that we click in Facebook is hard news. And so science is still trying to determine exactly how pronounced this effect is and in what capacities it exists. But one thing that seems very clear is that political news, specifically, seems to be one of the most polarizing topics on the entire internet. Pew Research, who I'm going to quote a lot here, does a lot of research around journalism and the people that interact with it. And so it mapped out the different connections and networks created by different types of Twitter conversations. And it found that political discussions on Twitter specifically tend to feature two big and distinct groups with little connection between them. These two groups are not on Twitter arguing with each other. They're on Twitter completely ignoring each other's existence. They point to different sites on the web. They use completely different hashtags. They have very little reason to even know that the other one exists. Pew's also found that the number of people who hold consistent conservative or consistent liberal ideologies has doubled in the past 25 years. And that is important because the people who fit into these categories of consistent ideology tend to be the ones who make their voices heard the loudest through every stage of the political process. It turns out that squeaky wheels tend to tweet a lot. And not only that, but the research has shown that the stronger your ideology is, the more likely you are to limit your social circles only to people who already agree with you. And so we know people who are consistently strong in one ideology or the other are becoming polarized much faster than those in the middle. Partisan animosity has also increased. The share of people who believe that the opposing party's policies are so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being has more than doubled since 1994. So it really shouldn't be that much of a surprise that it often feels like on the internet we're arguing in two completely separate universes. Because we basically are. I'm sorry that this graph does not move faster. So this is the polarization of the American public up to 2000, I think it's up to 2014. We are more polarized right now than we have been at any point since the American Civil War. This chart measures the voting patterns of Congress, right? And how likely each chamber of Congress is to vote strictly along party lines. the higher the line is, the more likely that chamber is to be pretty ideologically consistent. So if you see it, the House especially is like way up there. So to recap, people are increasingly getting political news from the internet, especially our age demographic. The share of people who have strong, consistently conservative or consistently liberal ideologies is increasing. Polarization is happening faster among these people because they are more likely to limit their social groups, and our government is more polarized than at any point into the Civil War. So news, alerts, 140 character sound bites from sources the same way that we do. So encouraged to have discussions in the real world anymore. We're encouraged to leave our political discussions online, like in the Facebook, where it's emotionally easier to have them, and we don't have to care so much what the emotional effect of our words are on what somebody else might be thinking or feeling. And this, all of this, whole presentation is having a huge effect on the internet's evolving role as the town square of our democracy. The town square, it's where questions come on our level. So this internet is doing its disruption in political space. So 2008, which was a really, really cool time to be in college, was a social media election. First election where it played a major role in the outcome. Barack Obama was the first candidate heavily engaging with people through their online social networks. His campaign spent over $16 million on online advertising in 2008, compared to Kane's camp, which spent a fraction of that at $3.6 million. 12 was the first types of data targeting. A candidate went in. Obama spent $52 million in online advertising during his 2012 campaign. This is double the amount spent by Mitt Romney. 2016, when all is said and done, and believe me when I tell you that this is going to be one of the most elections in America. Here's selling election. Candidates is dependent on our ability to hold the meeting. Donald Trump is a master at this, like unbelievable master. He uses social in a way that no candidate ever has before. He can get our attention, and then he can maintain it in a world of short attention spans, and it often doesn't even matter what it is he has to say. His tendency, if you pay attention, to say some of his more outrageous things typically will coincide with a moment in the polls when his relative popularity is down. This is assuredly on purpose. He seems to have complete control over his place in the news cycle, regardless of what the news has to say about it. And this style of politicking has gained him over $2 billion in earned media since last June, according to the New York Times. It's $2 billion. To put that into some context, if that were advertising spend, it would be 2.5 times the total amount of money spent on Barack Obama's 2012 campaign as a whole. Like, not just online, that includes TV and everything. So the public is more engaged election than they have been at this point in either of the two past presidential cycles, which is a kind of a big deal because 2008 was kind of a big deal. And frankly, Donald Trump is great for those of us in the business of media, either because people passionately support him or because they feel like they're watching a train that's on fire and careening fast towards the Grand Canyon. People can't help but click. Political sites like mine are seeing unprecedented and sustained traffic surges unlike anything that we have ever seen before. TV broadcasts rolling in record ratings for televised debates. Les Moonves, the chairman of CBS, who's got the goofy smile on the screen, has been quoted several times over the past few months saying something along the lines of, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. The money's rolling in, and this is fun. I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. I'm sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald." And it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation, right? Media Donald Trump because people are rapidly clicking on stories about Donald Trump. On the other hand, people are rapidly clicking on stories about Donald Trump because the media keeps covering Donald Trump. It's a whole field of study, I think, that's going to emerge out of this election. Donald's not the only candidate who's particularly good at using social. Bernie Sanders has the Reddit narrative locked down. Are there any Redditors in here? Yeah, okay. Unrelated, if you leave here and you move away, Reddit is a great place to meet people. An analysis by Pew showed that Sanders is far and away the most frequently mentioned candidate on Reddit. Articles about Bernie are much more likely to make it to the front page than articles about any other candidate. And this makes sense because the average Redditor is between the ages of 18 to 29 and tends to be male and tends to be more liberal. And this makes Reddit pretty much the perfect place for Bernie Sanders to connect with his target audience. And so all of this puts a significant value on the technologies and data that tracks the political pulse of the national conversation on the internet. And so we have several ways of doing this. First, the number of tweets that something gets is usually a pretty good measure of its place in the national conversation. Second, so this dashboard from the Associated Press throws in Google and Twitter, and it shows how much people are interested in things based on a baseline. And their baseline here is how much people were talking about the Iowa caucuses at the beginning of February. So if you're looking at it, I pulled this morning, so it's up to date. People are less interested in the election, probably because it's holiday weekend. Tweet volume is down too, at least compared to the Iowa caucus. It also monitors Google search interest drivers, which basically takes the total number of times that candidates are searched for and it puts it in relation to a rolling average. So Donald Trump is up 3% over the past 24 hours to his rolling average. Bernie Sanders is down 17%. And Ted Cruz is down 28%. We do the same thing for topics. So there's a 131% increase in the gun show loophole over the past 24 hours. Also the Syrian civil war, healthcare in the United States, Iran-U.S. relations, global warming. Global warming's not been a big topic, so I'm actually surprised to see that on the list. And usually, these search interest issue drivers correlate with what is going on in the rest of the world. That makes sense. They do this on Twitter, too. So Donald Trump is up 3% on Google. He's down 3% on Twitter, maybe because it was a holiday weekend. Same thing for Bernie Sanders. He was down 23% in Google searches and 46% in Twitter searches. And the most mentioned issues on Twitter are national security. This makes sense. That's usually what happens when there's a terrorist attack somewhere in the world. We had 2 over the course of the past week. Energy and environment's down 4%. Economy's up a little bit. Gun issues are down. So you kind of get a feeling for what it is that people on the internet are talking about at any given point. 538, which is run by the pollster Nate Silver, who is famous because he correctly predicted the 2012 election, mapped out locations to Facebook likes. And so this pulls in important insights into where in the country certain candidates are doing better than others on the internet. Now, 538 will be the first to caveat that Facebook likes are not the same thing as votes. And so this data set is more of a visual tool for overall popularity than it is actual election data. But if you look at it, Bernie Sanders tends to do great in urban areas and college towns. Donald Trump tends to do great everywhere else in the country. And then Ted Cruz has Texas because that's where he's from. And it's a little sad if you can't win your own home state. And I should also mention that Donald Trump has been famous for a very long time. And so we don't know if all of these likes came because he's running for president or if some of them existed just because he ran The Apprentice. So I've already mentioned that how media companies on the internet are making money is a really important piece of the equation here. Because typically, money follows traffic. And so Facebook and Google are starting to hold not only the methods of distribution of content, but also the content itself. Publishers are now being incentivized to publish their content directly within these platforms so that you as the user will never have to click away from your social network at all. This consolidates a tremendous amount of power into relatively few companies. And so this makes the tech companies that we trust with our data extremely valuable and extremely powerful because they're rapidly gaining the power to completely shape the world that we live in. Foreign Policy magazine provided this graphic, determined that Facebook, Apple, Twitter, Amazon, Microsoft, and Alphabet, which is Google, are now more powerful than some countries. This is both because of their annual revenues and because of the power that we entrust in them to protect our data and use it in appropriate ways. In fact, if you look at Apple alone, its cash in hand exceeds the GDP of 2/3 of the world's countries. So we know that the internet strips away some of our ability to empathize. We know that stories that do best are the ones that make us emotional. We know that we partially live in a world where our opinions aren't challenged, and we know that power is being increasingly consolidated into a few of the top players. So how do we work to fight this? So I think an emerging field of thought over the next decade or so is going to be in coming up with a type of algorithmic ethics, where the companies and watchdog organizations pay attention to the effects that their algorithms are having on internet populations, and they work to create a more integrated internet. Because what happens to the stories that we don't necessarily like, but that are important to the public good? How does a story about a fire in a refugee camp break through a news cycle about the latest Kanye Twitter rant? Yeah. How do the things that we need to see break through the things that we want to see? Unrelated. Kanye's tweet about suit jackets is like my favorite Kanye tweet of all time. So I'm not the only one who's noticed all of these things, and thank God, because otherwise this presentation would have been impossible to pull together. And so luckily, all of the companies that I've mentioned seem to have an awareness of their corporate responsibility here. This thing I'm really excited about just got released from Alphabet's Jigsaw team, and the Jigsaw team is there to create tools that help journalists better report on the world. It also helps with some cybersecurity issues. This tool tells you what topics were outside of the filter bubble for your country. And it helps us to design algorithms to fight them. So imagine if we could use this technology to actually algorithmically define our individual filter bubble and then purposefully break it. The internet is the biggest tool discovered or created by the human species. In its historical significance, it's on par with the ability to make fire and the wheel in how it's fundamentally changing who we are as a species. We now have the ability to access news and information from all over the world with just a click of a button. Anyone with an idea and some words is now a content generator. Breaking news events happen in real time on Twitter. We use the internet to learn. We use it to trade, to earn a living. We use it to meet a mate. And we use it to participate in our government. And since the internet has become the new town square where we as communities are having complex discussions about the future, but we're doing it without having to deal with the emotional reactions of each other. So we're losing our ability to empathize with each other, which means that we're losing our ability to get a broader picture of the world that we live in. Democracy only works if citizens are able to think beyond their own narrow self-interests. And so to do that, we have to be able to have a shared 360-degree view of the world we live in. We need to be able to recognize and come to terms with other people's lives and needs and desires. The internet kind of seems to be pushing us in the opposite direction of this. It creates this false impression that the world around us is all about us. And while this is especially good for getting people to buy things on the internet, it's not super great for people who are trying to make decisions about the type of democracy that they want to live in. And when we live in such isolated information bubbles, it makes the truth seem relative and cherry-picked. and it leaves us more susceptible to being lied to and manipulated. So in closing, I leave you with this. Be aware of how your own internet habits are contributing to your information consumption. To quote Eli Pariser, who writes a great book on this, the more we're able to interrogate how these algorithms work and what effects they have, the more we're able to shape our own information destinies. Next, purposefully seek out articles that you disagree with. And don't shy away from arguments with people around you that disagree with you. Usually, those arguments help you. And finally, when all of you graduate and you go out into the real world, you're going to have to deal with a lot of really cool emerging technologies that exist in the ad tech space. So be aware of the broader implications of the technologies that you're going to work with, because the effects are things that we're all going to have to live with.